The ice groaned like a dying animal as the convoy ship pushed through Murmansk harbor. Senior Sergeant Yuri Volkov stood on the frozen docks, his breath forming clouds that froze instantly on his collar. 3 weeks ago, he had crawled from a burning T-26 near Tikhvin while German shells turned the forest into splinters. 2 of his crew had not crawled out. Their screams still echoed in his dreams. Now Moscow had sent him here, to the edge of the world, to receive machines from strangers. The British tanks emerged from the cargo holds wrapped in frost and canvas. Valentine infantry tanks, the dockworkers called them. Yuri watched as cranes lowered them onto Soviet soil, these small foreign things that looked more like armored tractors than weapons of war. Around him, Soviet tankers laughed and pointed. "Look at this toy," one sergeant shouted. "My daughter has bigger wheels on her bicycle." Yuri did not laugh. He studied the machines with the careful eye of a man who had learned that arrogance killed faster than bullets. The Valentine stood barely 2 meters tall. Its armor sloped at strange angles. The turret mounted a 2-pounder gun that Soviet crews considered barely adequate against German reconnaissance vehicles, let alone the Panzer IIIs that had torn through their lines since June. Everything about it seemed wrong for the Eastern Front, where size meant survival and firepower meant victory. But then something happened that silenced the laughter. A British liaison sergeant climbed into one of the Valentines. The temperature had dropped to -31 degrees Celsius. At such cold, Soviet tank engines became blocks of frozen metal. Fuel turned to sludge. Batteries died. Crews spent hours building fires beneath their machines, praying the heat would thaw the engines enough to start. The British sergeant turned the ignition. The engine coughed once. Twice. On the 3rd attempt, it roared to life, steady and strong, its exhaust rising like a signal fire in the Arctic darkness. Yuri felt something shift in his chest. Not hope, he had abandoned hope at Tikhvin, but curiosity. What kind of machine started in weather that killed men? 3 days later, the Red Army assigned Yuri to command Valentine No. 847. His protests meant nothing. Officers needed experienced crew commanders, and Yuri had survived 4 tank engagements when most tankers died in their first. Survival made him valuable. His opinions did not. His new crew arrived that evening. Dmitry Petrov, the driver, was 19 years old with hollow eyes that belonged to a much older man. He had escaped the Kiev encirclement in September, walking 300 kilometers through German-occupied territory while his older brother bled out in a ditch because there was no transport for the wounded. He spoke rarely and flinched at sudden sounds. Alexander Morozov, the loader, carried bitterness like other men carried photographs of home. He trusted nothing and no one. His father had disappeared in 1937, taken by the NKVD for crimes that were never explained. Alexander had grown up under suspicion, denied advancement, denied trust, given only the most dangerous assignments because men like him were expendable. They gathered inside the Valentine for the first time, 3 strangers in a foreign machine, surrounded by instruments labeled in English they could not read. The interior smelled of oil and unfamiliar chemicals. The seats were too small. The ammunition racks were positioned wrong. Everything felt alien. "We will die in this British coffin," Alexander said flatly. "Moscow sends us garbage and calls it aid." Dmitry said nothing. His hands trembled on the driving controls. Yuri looked at them both, the broken young man and the bitter old soul, and understood that his real enemy was not outside the tank. It was inside. "Tomorrow we move to the assembly area," he said. "The counteroffensive begins in 3 days. Learn this machine or die in it. Those are your choices." That night, the temperature dropped to -38. Morning revealed a graveyard of frozen Soviet armor. T-34s sat silent, their legendary diesel engines defeated by the cold. KV-1 heavy tanks, the giants that had terrified German crews in the summer, stood motionless, their fuel lines cracked and weeping. Yuri climbed into the Valentine. His crew watched without hope. He pressed the starter, the engine turned over on the second try. Around them, Soviet mechanics stared in disbelief. A small British tank, mocked by everyone, sat running in conditions that had killed machines twice its size. Its exhaust rose steady and warm in the frozen air. Alexander's expression did not change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Dmitri's hand stopped trembling on the controls. Yuri allowed himself one small thought: perhaps this coffin would keep them alive long enough to matter. Outside, German forces advanced toward Moscow. The greatest battle in history was about to begin. And somewhere in the chaos, 3 men in a foreign tank would learn that survival depended not on what you trusted, but on what refused to fail you. The Valentine's engine hummed. Waiting. The frozen corpse of a German soldier pointed east, his arm raised as if directing traffic toward Moscow. Dmitri steered the Valentine around him without comment. After 3 weeks in the Reserve salient, dead men had become landmarks. The Soviet winter counteroffensive had shattered German dreams of quick victory, but the enemy had not broken. They had dug in along the WWII line, creating a bulge in the front that would consume hundreds of thousands of lives over the next year. Every village became a fortress. Every frozen stream became a killing ground. Yuri's Valentine, which Dmitri had named Nadezhda, the Russian word for hope, had survived 12 engagements. Not through firepower. The 2-pounder gun could barely scratch German medium tanks. Not through armor. A direct hit from an anti-tank gun would end them instantly. They survived through movement, through hiding, through the simple miracle of an engine that started every morning when heavier Soviet tanks sat frozen and helpless. The night march began at 2,200 hours. Yuri's orders were simple: reach the assembly point at Sykievka by dawn, join the attack force, support infantry against German defensive positions. Simple orders that ignored the reality of moving through a frozen nightmare where the temperature had dropped to -41 degrees. They found the column at midnight. 60 Soviet soldiers lay scattered across a forest road, their transport truck standing silent with engines that would never start again. Some men had frozen where they fell, caught by the cold before they could reach shelter. Others huddled in groups, sharing body heat, their wounds wrapped in bloody rags that had turned stiff as boards. Dmitri stopped the tank without orders. "Drive," Alexander said immediately. "We have a mission." "They are dying," Dmitri whispered. "Everyone is dying. That is what war means." Yuri climbed out of the turret and dropped into the snow. A young lieutenant stumbled toward him, his face white with frostbite, his words slurred by cold. The column had been carrying wounded from a field hospital when the trucks failed. They had waited for rescue. No rescue came. Yuri counted the bodies. 14 already dead. The rest would follow within hours. "How many can walk?" he asked. The lieutenant shook his head. "Maybe 20. The rest." He did not finish. Yuri looked back at Nadezhda. The Valentine's engine compartment was warm, its exhaust a stream of heat in the frozen darkness. The tank could carry men on its hull, could tow wounded on improvised sleds, could ferry the dying through territory where German patrols hunted Soviet stragglers, but the assembly point was 30 kilometers east. The attack began at dawn. Missing it meant charges of desertion, and deserters faced the wall. "We do not stop," Alexander said from the turret. His voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "We are tank crew, not ambulance drivers. Our duty is to the mission." Dmitri's hands gripped the steering levers. He was thinking of his brother, Yuri realized. His brother who had bled out near Kiev because there was no transport for the wounded. "If we stop," Alexander continued, "we die with them. All of us. For nothing." He was right. Yuri knew he was right. War demanded such calculations. Commanders made them every day, spending lives like currency, buying victory with corpses. "Load the wounded," Yuri said. The next 6 hours became a blur of desperate movement and careful terror. Nadezhda crawled east with men clinging to every surface, wounded soldiers strapped to improvised sleds made from truck doors, walking casualties stumbling alongside in the tank's warm exhaust trail. German reconnaissance found them near the village of Olnino. 2 armored cars appeared on the road ahead, their turrets swinging toward the strange procession. Yuri had seconds to decide. Dmitri, hard left. Into the trees. The Valentine plunged into a birch forest, branches scraping armor, wounded men crying out as they were thrown against metal. The German cars followed, their guns opening fire, tracers cutting through the darkness. Yuri could not fight them directly. The 2-pounder would take 3 or 4 hits to disable an armored car, and German gunners would not miss at this range. But he knew this forest. He had studied the maps for hours during the frozen nights. "The river," he said. "Take us to the river." Dmitri understood. The Volga's frozen tributaries were treacherous in winter. Ice that seemed solid could shatter under weight. Soviet tanks had learned this through painful experience. But the Valentine was lighter than almost any armored vehicle on the Eastern Front. They burst from the treeline onto the frozen riverbed. Behind them, the German armored cars followed, confident in their heavier guns. The ice held beneath Nadezhda.it did not hold beneath the Germans. Yuri heard the crack even over the engine noise. Then screaming metal as one armored car broke through, then the second, their crews scrambling as freezing water pulled them down. They reached Soviet lines at dawn with 31 survivors. They had missed the assembly point by 6 hours. The commander called it desertion. The punishment was another suicide mission: scout the German defensive line. Alone. No support. No rescue. Nadezhda's engine was still warm. Yuri climbed back inside. "We go forward," he said. Dmitri nodded. Alexander said nothing, but he did not argue. Hope was all they had left. On the 4th day behind enemy lines, Alexander spoke about his father for the first time. They were hiding in a burned-out church, Nadezhda covered with debris and frozen branches, while a German convoy passed less than 200 meters away. The engine was silent but still warm, ready to start if they needed to run. Through a crack in the ruined wall, Yuri counted 18 trucks, 4 half-tracks, and 2 tanks, Panzer IIIs with their distinctive short-barreled guns. "My father was a teacher," Alexander whispered. "Mathematics. He loved numbers the way priests love God. He said numbers never lied, never betrayed, never changed their nature to survive." Dmitri glanced back from the driver's seat, surprised by the sudden confession. In 1937, someone reported him for making a joke about collectivization. The NKVD came at night. We never saw him again. Alexander's voice was flat, emotionless, describing horror as if it were weather. "After that, I learned that trust is a weapon your enemies use against you. Trust no one. Depend on nothing. That is how you survive." The convoy passed. Silence returned to the frozen forest. "Then why are you still here?" Yuri asked quietly. "You could have run at Murmansk. Disappeared into the chaos. No one tracks individual soldiers in this war." Alexander was silent for a long moment. "Because running would prove them right," he finally said. "Every commissar, every officer who looked at me like I was already a traitor. If I run, my father's memory becomes a criminal's legacy. If I fight, perhaps." He shook his head. "I do not know what I believe anymore." They had been ghosts for 11 days now, moving only at night, hiding by day, surviving on frozen rations and melted snow. The Valentine's reliability had become their salvation. While German vehicles struggled with the brutal cold, requiring hours of preparation before their engines would start, Nadezhda came alive with a turn of the key. They could run when others could not. They could hide where others would freeze. The intelligence they gathered painted a picture of German desperation. Fuel shipments were failing across the entire front. Vehicles sat abandoned, their engines cracked by frost. German soldiers wrapped themselves in stolen Soviet winter clothing, their summer uniforms proving worthless against temperatures their commanders had never anticipated. On the 9th day, they found a supply depot. It sprawled across a former collective farm, warehouses full of ammunition and fuel, repair facilities working around the clock to keep German armor moving. Yuri observed it for 2 days through binoculars, mapping positions, counting guards, noting shift changes, but he also saw something else: Soviet prisoners, perhaps 200 men, kept in an open pen with no shelter, used as slave labor to load supplies and dig fortifications. Each morning, guards dragged frozen corpses from the pen and threw them in a pit behind the warehouses. Each night, more men died. We report the location and move on, Alexander said. That is our mission. Reconnaissance. Not rescue. They will all be dead before any attack reaches them, Dmitri said. That is not our concern. Yuri watched the prisoners through his binoculars. Skeletal men in rags, moving slowly, mechanically, waiting for death. Some of them had probably fought at Kiev, at Smolensk, at Vyazma. They had been soldiers once. Now they were ghosts, just like his crew. We can destroy the fuel depot, he said slowly. Set fires. Create chaos. In the confusion, some might escape. And kill the prisoners in the explosions, Alexander replied. You would murder them to save them? Not explosions. Distraction. We draw the guards away, break the fence, give them a chance to run. 3 men against a depot garrison. That is suicide. Yuri turned to face him. You said you fight so your father's memory is not a criminal's legacy. These men have families too. Fathers. Sons. If we leave them, we become the betrayers. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of impossible choices. I spent my whole life hating people who abandoned others to save themselves, Alexander finally said. Perhaps it is time to become someone different. They attacked at dawn. Nadezhda burst from the tree line at full speed, Dmitri pushing the engine harder than it was designed to run. Yuri fired the 2-pounder at fuel drums, not to destroy them but to create chaos, to draw attention. German soldiers scrambled from their barracks, confused by an attack from a direction they had assumed was secure. Alexander had climbed out earlier, moving through the darkness with wire cutters. As German guards rushed toward the tank, he opened the prisoner pen and screamed one word, run. Some prisoners stood frozen, unable to believe what was happening. Others understood immediately and scattered into the forest. Guards turned back, torn between the attacking tank and the escaping prisoners. Yuri led the Germans on a chase through the depot, weaving between buildings, using the Valentine's small size to navigate spaces larger tanks could not follow. A bullet cracked against the turret. Then another. Something hit the engine compartment with a metallic scream. We are hit, Dmitri reported, his voice steady despite the fear beneath it, but the engine kept running. They collected Alexander at the prearranged point, 17 prisoners following him through the snow. Behind them, the depot burned, not from explosions but from scattered fuel igniting in the chaos of pursuit. Yuri turned Nadezhda east. 200 kilometers to Soviet lines. A damaged tank. 17 starving men, and the temperature was dropping again. Dmitri could no longer feel his hands. He had stopped mentioning it on the 3rd day of their journey east, when the frostbite turned his fingers white and then gray. Now he drove by memory, by instinct, by the desperate need to keep moving because stopping meant death. The temperature had reached -43 degrees Celsius. At such cold, metal became brittle and shattered. Fuel thickened into gel. Human flesh froze solid in minutes. The survivors from the depot huddled on Nadezhda's engine deck, pressed against the warm metal, sharing body heat in clusters of 3 and 4. They had started with 17 rescued prisoners. Now there were 11. The dead were left where they fell. There was no time for burial, no energy for mourning. Yuri said a few words over each body before they moved on, small prayers that the wind scattered into the frozen wilderness. The living watched with hollow eyes, understanding that their turn might come tomorrow. Or tonight. Or in the next hour. Alexander had changed. The bitter, suspicious man who trusted nothing had become something else entirely. He gave his rations to the weakest prisoners. He carried men on his back when they could no longer walk. He spoke to the dying in soft tones, holding their hands as they slipped away, telling them they had done enough, that their families would know they fought bravely. Why? Yuri asked him on the 5th night, as they sat in the darkness while Nadezhda's engine idled to keep the survivors warm. Because someone should, Alexander replied simply. My father believed in kindness, even when kindness brought him nothing but suffering. I spent years being angry at him for that. Now I understand. He looked at the sleeping prisoners, at Dmitri's bandaged hands, at the damaged tank that refused to die. We do not become better by protecting ourselves. We become better by protecting others. The German blocking position appeared on the seventh day. 4 armored cars spread across the only road through a narrow valley. Beyond them, perhaps 10 kilometers distant, Soviet lines waited. Safety. Warmth. Medical care that might save Dmitri's hands. Yuri studied the enemy through his binoculars. The cars were positioned well, covering each other, blocking any vehicle that tried to pass. Infantry dug in on either side of the road. There was no way around. The hills were too steep, the snow too deep for a damaged tank to navigate. We cannot fight them, Dmitri said. His voice was steady, but Yuri heard the exhaustion beneath it, the acceptance that this might be the end. No, Yuri agreed. We cannot. Alexander looked at the prisoners. 11 men who had survived hell, who had walked 200 kilometers through frozen wilderness, who were so close to freedom they could almost taste it. Then what? Yuri made his decision. We do not need to win, he said. We need to buy time. You take the prisoners into the hills. Move slowly. Stay hidden. I will draw their attention. That is suicide, Dmitri said. Perhaps. But Nadezhda can take hits that would kill a man. She can survive long enough for you to reach the lines, long enough for Soviet patrols to hear the gunfire and investigate. Yuri touched the cold metal of the turret. She has kept us alive this long. Now I ask her to do it one more time. Alexander opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. He understood. Someone had to stay. Someone had to give the others a chance. Then I stay with you, he said. The prisoners need you to guide them. They need hope. You are their hope. Alexander smiled, a strange expression on a face that had forgotten how to smile. I finally found something worth trusting. Let me prove I was right. Dmitri's ruined hands gripped the steering levers. I cannot leave either. I am the driver. Without me, she does not move. Yuri looked at his crew. The broken young man who had found purpose. The bitter loner who had discovered faith. Both of them willing to die for strangers they had met a week ago. Together, then, he said, Nadezhda charged the German line at full speed. The armored cars opened fire immediately, their guns tracking the small tank as it weaved and dodged. Yuri returned fire, not aiming to kill but to distract, to draw attention away from the hills where 11 prisoners scrambled through the snow toward freedom. A shell struck the turret. Then another hit the tracks. Nadezhda shuddered but kept moving, her engine roaring defiance at the cold and the enemy and death itself. The Soviet cavalry patrol found them 20 minutes later, drawn by the sound of battle. They swept down on the German position from the north, sabers flashing in the pale winter sun, overwhelming the distracted enemy in minutes. When the fighting ended, Nadezhda sat motionless in the snow. Her tracks were destroyed. Her turret was jammed. Smoke poured from a dozen holes in her armor, but her engine was still running, and her crew was still alive. Spring came slowly to the Soviet Union in 1942. Snow melted into mud. Frozen rivers began to flow. And in a rear-area hospital, Dmitry Petrov sat beside a window, watching mechanics work on a small British tank that had traveled further than anyone had expected. His hands would heal. The doctor said he might even drive again. Yuri visited every week, bringing news from the front, sharing letters from Alexander who had been transferred to a training unit to teach new crews about survival. The intelligence from the German depot had proven valuable. A major among the rescued prisoners had provided information that saved thousands of lives. They want to give us medals, Yuri said one afternoon. For the depot raid. For the prisoners. Dmitri smiled. What about Nadezhda? She goes back to the front. New tracks. New turret. Same engine. Yuri paused. The mechanics say they have never seen anything like it. Temperatures that killed Soviet tanks, German tanks, everything. and she just kept starting. She is British, Dmitri said. They are stubborn people. Yes. Yuri touched the window, looking at the tank below. But she became Russian. She learned what we know, that survival is not about strength. It is about refusing to stop. The Valentine's engine turned over, coughing once before settling into a steady rhythm. Mechanics cheered. Somewhere, a crew waited to take her back to war, Nadezhda. Hope. The machine that started every morning, she was ready to run again.